This video is going to compare two different patterns for how we can achieve stubbing within Mockito. So first we're going to look at thenReturn, and then we're going to look at doReturn for the same method call. We're then going to compare these two at compile time, and then we're going to compare them at runtime so that we can better understand which pattern we would like to use for different circumstances when stubbing our methods with Mockito. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more weekly videos on Java, also subscribe to the channel. So if we take a look at the class that we'll be testing, it's really simple and it's called CarShop, and CarShop has just one method called getStock for brand. So essentially we're going to be passing in a brand of a car into this method, and we just want to know how much of that car that we have in stock within our CarShop. So first we define a map of string to integer. The string will be the brand and the integer will be the number of stock we have for that brand. And we call this getCarsInStock method down below, which in theory connects to a database and just returns that map to us. And then if our CarsInStock map contains the brand that we have, we will just return the number of stock that it has. Otherwise we throw a new runtime exception just saying this car brand is not in stock. So this will be the method down below that we'll be mocking, so we can mock how our database call will respond to us, and we're going to have a look at how we can do this using thenReturn and also doReturn. Okay, so I've created this CarShop test and I've just marked it with the run with and then Mockito JUnit runner class just at the top, so we know that we'll be able to use Mockito and the annotations within our class down below. So I'm just going to start by creating a simple test for cars in shop. And the first item I want to create is just a spy version of our CarShop. And if I go back to the CarShop, this will be the method that we're mocking. So I want to create a mocked version of a string to integer map, and then I'm just going to populate that within the test, and then later what we can do is force our spy to always return that map whenever we call the getCarsInStock method call. So our cars in stock just has one entry, which will be Jaguar, and that will return the value of 10. And now I'm going to begin writing the first thenReturn statement, and we'll be using this pattern. So first we write when, and then we pass in the object and the method call that we would like to mock. So this will be CarShop spy, and then the getCarsInStock method. And then we tell our spy to then return our cars in stock that we've defined just up above every time that we call that method. So now down below I can just write a very simple assertion. So what we're asserting is that when we call getStock for brand and pass in the name Jaguar, the value we will receive will be 10, so we'll be passing in Jaguar here. The getCarsInStock method will always return this map of Jaguar and the number 10. And then if it contains the key, which it will then get the value for that brand, which will be 10. And now I'm just going to write the equivalent sort of mock statement that we can write, but this time we would use doReturn. So the way we do this is by first writing doReturn, and the value that we want to return will be the cars in stock. And then we pass in what spy is going to be called, so that will be our CarShop spy. We close the bracket, and then we say what method call is going to be made, and that will be getCarsInStock. And now I can just comment out the thenReturn method. I can run this test and it should be performing in the exact same way. And just for completeness, if I then change the value at the top to 9, we can now expect this test to fail. We can now see that it's failed, and this is very much the skeleton of our comparison between thenReturn and also doReturn. So if we do a quick comparison at the compile time between thenReturn and doReturn, there's just a couple items that I'd like to point out. So I'd probably say that the when CarShop spy getCarsInStock, thenReturn CarsInStock reads slightly better than doReturn CarsInStock when CarShop spy getCarsInStock. So there's a slight difference between thenReturn and doReturn at compile time, which is when we're just reading the code through, but that could be a subjective sort of opinion that you might have. Perhaps you like doReturn over thenReturn as it comes to reading. And the second item is that there's actually a type check being performed by thenReturn on the item that we're passing in, as opposed to doReturn. So doReturn doesn't actually perform any type check on what we have here. So for example, above, if I were to change this just to the number 1, we get a small red line, and that's because the getCarsInStock method expects us to return a map of string to integer, whereas here we're just passing a single integer. Whereas if I were to change the doReturn method to just the number 1, we actually don't have a compile time check, so we don't have that red line. Of course, when we try to run this test, if we were trying to use this doReturn method, it would then throw a runtime exception for us. However, the thenReturn method just up above will capture that for us before this needs to happen. So down below it says integer cannot be returned by getCarsInStock method, and this is just a simple comparison at compile time between doReturn and thenReturn. So now we can compare how thenReturn and doReturn differ at runtime. I'm just going to head into the car shop and I'm going to add a print line in the getCarsInStock method. I'm going to comment out doReturn, so now we're going to use the thenReturn method, and I'm just going to run this test. And we can see that the test has passed and getting cars in stock has been printed into the console. So that tells us that this getCarsInStock method has been called when using thenReturn, even though we're fixing the result that comes out of this method of getCarsInStock. So I'm just going to flip back over to doReturn. And in a similar way, the test has passed. However, down below we don't actually have that print line method coming from doReturn. So this is a key difference between thenReturn and doReturn, because doReturn doesn't actually call this method, and that's why this print line hasn't been printed down below. Whereas thenReturn will actually call that method, so this may be a determining factor in whether you call doReturn or thenReturn. One thing to note is that if you're using a method that has a lot of operations that are performed and all you're actually doing is mocking the behavior of what is returned from that method, it would probably be better to use doReturn as opposed to thenReturn, because thenReturn will actually call that method and do all that processing otherwise. And you also need to consider if your method is going to be throwing any runtime exceptions or any other kinds of exceptions. So if I change this now to throw new runtime exception, and I go back into the test, this runtime exception will not be thrown when we use doReturn. Whereas if we flip over to thenReturn, we can now expect that runtime exception to be included within our test. So we can see that the runtime exception has now been thrown from Java line 22. So this is something to consider when using thenReturn versus doReturn. So it's whether or not you actually want that method call to be made, or whether you just want it to be purely mocked for the purposes of your test. And another effect that you may want to consider is if your method has any side effects. So for example, if getCarsInStock was doing more operations, let's say it was adding further items into the list, or it was changing the way that our getStock might be behaving, we then might want to consider using doReturn as opposed to thenReturn to avoid any side effects from the method call that is being made at runtime. So this is a really simple introduction to the differences between thenReturn and doReturn. There's a couple key differences at compile time where the type is being checked, and also about the readability. And then at runtime, when we use doReturn, the method call is not actually being made, but it's being fixed to return the item that we want it to return within our test. Whereas when we use thenReturn, we are actually going to be making this method call within our class. So we might want to consider if there's any exceptions being thrown, or if there's any side effects of that method. So that summarizes this video on the differences between thenReturn and doReturn.